case of a state with Sharia law that was not oppressive. So, I guess this question is with an assumption that it has been oppressive.
That's an interesting question. That's an interesting question. I wish I knew who asked that. I think that the actual question should be, has there ever been a state in history that's not oppressive? I mean, the state is kind of, the idea of the state is sort of by definition something that constrains the activities of people living under it in some way or another. When does that become oppressive? That is, I think that's a question that can only be answered in a specific place and a specific time by specific people with their own ideas of what freedom entails, what appropriate freedom entails. So I don't think that. I think actually the answer to the question would be the way we think about oppressive states. All pre-modern states, pretty much, and certainly, let's say, let's just take an example of a Muslim state. Let's take the Abbasid Caliphate in 900. If you're living in a village in, a village in western Iran in the year 900, you pretty much have actually no interaction with the state. The Abbasid Caliphate is not oppressive to you because you have no interaction with it. Except one time a year, somebody comes around and collects taxes, and that's it. And those taxes might be high, but there's not much you can do about it. And our taxes are sometimes high in this country too, right? If high taxes is oppressive, then it depends. I don't think, let's say the taxes aren't particularly high that year. I don't think that state is oppressive. You don't have parking laws. You don't have, you can have bonfires in your backyard, you can raise chickens, there's no local codes about, like in my neighborhood, how you have to have 1 acre for every chicken you want to own. You can have chickens, if there's local disputes, it's not the state who's going to adjudicate these disputes. It's probably going to be the respected elders in the village. So I think that actually the way we think about states, modern states are almost by definition much more oppressive than pre-modern states because they actually have the technology to be oppressive. Pre-modern states, you don't have enough people to go around and watch what's happening in every single village. I don't know if that answers the question.
The next question is for Ustadah Tahera. How does one find their identity if they were raised in a very conservative Islamic setting and the Muslims in their college campus are relatively liberal? How do I stick with my values without coming off as offensive or stuck up?
Well, obviously this is a question that whoever asked this question, no, I shouldn't do that, okay? It's too embarrassing, right? We can always chat afterwards. I guess that's what I was trying to say, is that every situation is going to be different, and obviously the chaplain side of me is wanting to make sure that there's time for therapy afterwards. But okay, so I can just tell you from my own experience, right? I was raised in a traditional Muslim home, went to a private Muslim school until grade 8. Then I chose to go to a public high school because I wanted to interact with the other, so to speak. And for the most part, I felt like I was organically part of the community because I was, three-sporter, played varsity basketball and, ran track and things like that. And but September 11th occurred in my senior year of high school, which, led me to question, who were the quote-unquote Taliban and like, what does it mean to be an Islamic fundamentalist? What is a traditionalist? What are classical texts? And that query actually started, I think, partially due to September 11th. And so when I was studying in the madrasa, right, I was also pursuing an undergrad degree in biochemistry because my dad's a neurosurgeon, and as most of you know, Indian parents are like, you have to become a doctor or engineer or pharmacist, right? So here I was, right, in these two kind of what I consider like dual worlds, right? You have the traditional madrasa, and then you have this secular campus. And day in and day out, I'm studying with people who will, you know, especially with the shuyukh, won't even look at you, right, out of respect. Most of the sisters wore niqab. And then I would step outside of the madrasa into this world where the brothers and sisters of the MSA were going out and eating together on campus, and sitting next to Dr. Brown would be, I would probably sit, okay, I would probably, you know, just prefer to sit, you know, like, that was kind of, those were the questions that I was, you know, dealing with, and it may seem mundane, right, or seem kind of like, all right, just grow out of that, right, but they were real to me, right, and they are real to people who come from that traditional setting, so to speak. And so my first kind of response to that is that, you know, don't feel that you are obligated to not you know, go through that process. That you should feel comfortable to acknowledge that questioning yourself and how you identify yourself and what you prefer in terms of your safe space or your comfortable, like, zone, so to speak, that is something that is your right? You can feel that way. But at the same time, you have to understand that Muslims on a college campus are coming from various backgrounds, and people have a difference of opinion in how they're going to deal with, you know, other Muslims as well as non, you know, friends or people of another faith. So, so that's the first thing I wanted to say, is that you don't feel that you have to conform right off the bat to something that you are not comfortable with. And I think that's a given, and I think you all understand that. You guys are all, you know, young adults and are bright young people. So that's a given. But as far as some practical advice, I would say that, you know, as you're developing your Muslim identity in college, recognize that it's important to be with people that are always going to inspire you in your own growth, right? And sometimes that may mean that you're kind of pushing the barriers a little bit, you're testing the water, so to speak. But as long as you come back to an understanding that this is allowing you to really move towards your goal, whatever it is, right? It's particularly when it comes to your own growth and of your own faith identity. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that you need to start assessing that. Sorry, it's been a really long day from yesterday. I was at the airport for like 7 hours, and then it's been a long day today, so my thoughts are kind of disheveled right now. But I think you understand basically the point I'm trying to make, is that you shouldn't feel like you have to conform to something that you are not comfortable with, and yet at the same time allow yourself to be inspired through people and be open to the different changes without, you know, judging the other, so to speak.
This is a question for Dr. Brown. In Muslim states, has there been a case of Sharia law not serving the political persuasions of the rulings? For example, Saudi Arabia making Twitter haram and ancient illegal.
I mean, has there ever been an interest in a state in which the Sharia judges judged in a way that was against the interest of the government? Yes, definitely. I mean, that was kind of a source of tension with Muslim rulers historically, and so I mean, one example I can think of is in Cairo in about, I think it was around the early 1400s, there was a couple that was caught fornicating, a man or woman, and they admitted they were caught, and they admitted, you know, we were fornicating. Don't know if they put it that way, but, and they were, so they were going to be stoned. And then the man recanted his confession. And according to these evidentiary standards I spoke about earlier, if you recant your confession, it didn't happen. It has to be dealt with as a ta'zir punishment. It's no longer going to be a had punishment case. And so the ruler, for some reason, was really upset about this, and he was going to kill the couple anyway. And very famous, the ruler's name was Al-Ghuri. Very impressive. He was, I think, the last Mamluk Sultan before the Ottoman invasion. So actually this would have been the late 1400s, before the Ottoman invasion of 1517. And the chief judge said, the chief Sharia court judge said, whoever kills these people will be killed for that, deserves to be killed for that. If you execute these two people now, you will be a murderer. And this was a major, so he was actually punished, the Sharia court judge was punished for that. Other Sharia court judges, just in that same time period, Cairo in, let's say, the 1400s, a scholar ruled against building a mosque over the tomb of a certain Mamluk, one of the ruler's sort of close buddies. He ruled against that, and he was fired from his job and made persona non grata. And there's all sorts of other instances. I'm just talking about Egypt in the 1400s. It's pretty regular that you had the Sharia judges coming into conflict with the state. And that's why a lot of times you had, in the Mamluk period in Cairo, for example, you had the ruler set up 4 different chief judges, one from every school of law, so that he could actually kind of go fatwa shopping when he wanted something. If he didn't get it from one judge, he'd get it from another one.
Sister Tahera, Ahmed, what harm do you see of MSAs co-sponsoring with LGBTQ groups? Does it mean we agree with them? What are your maybe guidelines you encourage your MSAs to follow?
Okay, so first of all, for those of you who are not familiar, right, does everyone here, when I say LGBT, everyone's clear? Okay, so basically we're talking about the lesbian, the gay, the transsexual and bisexual community. So the question was, what are some kind of considerations to think about when if and when you should work with them? Is that what I understood?
Sorry, can you repeat that?
I was just, okay.
You're clarifying, okay.
Okay, so from my own individual experiences on the Northwestern campus, so Northwestern actually has, according to our Student Resource Center, 10% of our student population identifies with the LGBT community. So that doesn't necessarily mean that everyone has a particular sexual or that they identify with within the sexual orientation of the LGBT community, but that they have some connection to that community. So for us, it's a community that's large, and our campus and our MSA does work with them. But here are some of the things that we've laid as principles of engagement, so to speak. We've agreed that as an MSA, at least this particular MSA for this year, to engage with the community on issues that are beneficial for the overall campus community, as well as the larger context of Evanston and beyond. So issues of environment, issues of creating more awareness about global warming and issues that are going to bring benefit overall. Now, if they ask us to support an activity or programming that endorses a particular stance on the permissibility of homosexuality, that is when we've decided that we're going to refrain from engagement in that particular programming. And what's great is that we've had enough conversations with the leadership of the LGBT community on campus about how we feel and why we feel the way we feel, right? So in terms of what are the parameters that we work within. So they understand that this is not an inherent disengagement on our part for the reasons of, mere reasons like, oh, we just don't like gay people or something, right? This was clarified to them that this is our stance. This is something that we believe in, and this is, we want to engage with you on issues that are prevalent to both of our communities. So I would suggest a similar path that if we're working with them on issues that are going to be overall beneficial to our communities. But when it comes to asking for us to participate in a gay rights parade or a walk on campus, we've actually refused. in some cases. But the relationship is healthy enough for us to take a step back, and they understand that this is not a critique of their sexual identity. This is a critique of what we disagree with. It's a basic disagreement, it's a fundamental disagreement, and they understand that they cannot create a double standard of that, meaning they acknowledge that we differ, and that they agree that it's okay for us to differ. Does that make sense?
This next question is for Dr. Brown. If Sharia kept changing according to the local laws, what are the limiting factors from it changing entirely?
That's a very good question. I didn't want to suggest that Sharia changes completely place to place. There's what's known as the thawabits, so things that are fixed that don't change, and then there's the mutaghayyirat, things that do change. And one of the major principles in Islamic law, certainly as it was understood from sort of 1400s until today, is that rulings change according to place and time and situation and person and regimes. But when we talk about these rulings, we're not talking about things like alcohol being allowed. There's no situation in which alcohol is going to be allowed. Obviously, if you're dying of thirst and you need to drink and there's only wine, you can drink it. Obviously, if someone has to amputate your leg because you're on a desert island, you've been injured, and there's a big bottle of whiskey that you can numb your pain with, you can drink it. Right? We're not talking about exceptional circumstance. But there's no situation in which somehow you're going to be living in a society where it's okay to drink alcohol. Right? There's no situation in which it's going to be completely allowed for people to have sex outside of marriage. These situations don't arise. So there's certain laws that don't change, but certain things do change. For example, can you buy or sell something that doesn't exist? A general position in Islamic law is that al-ma'dum la yajuz. You can't buy or sell something that doesn't exist yet, because there's inherent risk involved. No one knows what this thing is yet. We talked about this a bit this morning. But for example, in Maliki school of law, if you are in a society where it's custom, it's normal in that society to buy and sell things that don't exist, like let's say you live in America and you order all your shirts from Land's End or something like that. One of my professors used to do that. And I don't know if they exist yet, but let's say they have to go and make the shirt based on your size. You pay for it. But this is how things are done in the United States. You know what you're going to get, pretty much. And if you don't like what you get, you return it and you don't pay anything. So these kind of things are going to change from time to time, place to place. What is an appropriate dowry for a woman when she's getting married? When is the dowry paid? Is it paid before the marriage, after the consummation of the marriage? Is it paid all in the beginning, or you pay a small amount in the beginning, and then there's an amount if the husband divorces the wife without cause, then he pays the rest of the dowry at the end? These are the kind of things that are going to change from place to place, time to time.
Sister Ustadah Ahmed, I'm going to combine two questions, so if you're out there and you're wondering what's happening, that's what I'm doing. Are there any harms to MSAs to be more inclusive? How do we balance between being inviting but still sticking to our Muslim conservative ideals? And then another person kind of relates it personally and says that she's heard other Muslims say all Afghans are either Taliban or very loose. As a Muslim, how should we deal with judgmental and prejudice within our own faith? So she said that another Muslim I know made a comment that either they're Taliban or very loose. So either very conservative or very, not even conservative.
Unacceptably liberal.
Okay, so you're saying within the MSA setting, how open should you be to dealing with...
Maybe I should separate the questions. Okay, the first one is, are there any harms to MSAs being more inclusive? How do we balance between being inviting but still sticking to our Muslim conservative ideals? And I think that's addressing all Muslims from different backgrounds that have maybe a different understanding.
Okay, so I mean, obviously, I don't see a harm in making sure that everyone is part of the community. I mean, that's a given. I think everyone here understands that. I mean, in fact, if this MSA didn't really acknowledge that, then I don't think that this setting in itself would exist. So I mean, I don't understand if there was a very specific question to that. I see that as a given, right? Most of you understand that there's benefit in making sure that people from various backgrounds come together and that everyone is in a different place, right, in their journey towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and allowing for people to grow in that is definitely a function of the MSA, I would say. Now, there are, and again, for example, Chicago, according to the CIOGC, which is the Council of Islamic Organizations of Greater Chicago, did a survey and estimates about 400,000 Muslims in the Greater Chicagoland region, and the schools, depending on where you're at, are the MSA will really differ in terms of the culture of that organization. So UIC, the University of Chicago, the state school, is quite different in terms of the way they interact and the way the MSA, even their programming, for example. So, the brothers and sisters there have a very different perspective on gender relations than, for example, at Northwestern or even at Loyola University, which is right by the lake. One of the things that I've seen very this is a trend, and again, there's no stat for me to quote because I haven't done any particular case study on it, but one kind of trend, and I've talked to some of my colleagues about this. I mean, Amr Muzaffar as well, who frequently goes to various campuses and teaches, and both informally and formally, and we were discussing some of the trends, and what's interesting is that schools where there seems to be a lot of immigrant population, like first generation, second generation Muslims, who have a particular understanding of what is the Sharia, so to speak, from their own parents and what was taught in a madrasa setting, are superimposing that into their MSA. So for example, there are MSAs where there is a parda, right? There's a barrier between the brothers and the sisters. And it's always there whenever they have an activity. And I'm not saying that, they're doing something wrong. I'm saying that this is the reality of how they come together. And this is what the sisters actually prefer, and this is what the brothers prefer. Now, every year is different. One year, the Loyola MSA had the sisters really, including my own sister, had an issue with having kind of this wall in between the men and the women. And it got so, it got a lot of talk and conversation about it, to the extent where, the Sun-Times actually did an article on Loyola University and the MSA and the curtain and, between the brothers and sisters. And so the real issue was that the MSA wasn't having conversations, right, about what is inclusion and, what does it mean when we have various understandings and people come together and talk about what that is, right? So with the Loyola MSA students, my sister's main issue was, and she's actually quoted in the paper, she's like, if I'm not against a curtain, I'm against the concept that a woman's voice is not being heard, period. Like, no, the brothers don't want to hear what I have to say. So, and of course that extends into so many other aspects of MSA culture and life. So having conversations, I think is really significant within the MSA.
Dr. Brown, this is your question. How do we explain stoning of adulterers and cutting hands of thieves to non-Muslims? Should we say that it was justice, or should we deny its application entirely?
That's a good question. I think sometimes I get confused because a lot of people in this country don't seem to have a problem, electrocuting people until they catch on fire or something. It's just cruel. There's a lot of things that done in the United States that I think are extremely cruel and unusual forms of punishment. Putting someone in prison for their entire life, underground, in solitary confinement, in communication management units, or in Tahera prison, or in solitary confinement for 30 years, 40 years, 80 years, which is what happens regularly to Muslims in this country. I mean, I think that is inhuman. And by the way, these are for offenses like, feeding, in the case of the Holy Land Foundation, which was a charity giving money to Palestinians, the government even said that no money ever went to any violent ends. No money went to assist terrorist operations or anything. It all went to the orphan. Because these, Zakat communities which were given the money, which by the way the same Zakat communities that the US government and UN was giving money to, because they were somehow linked to Hamas, these people were engaged in material support for terrorism. Now they're in prison for between anywhere up to 65 years in these horrendous communication management units. Their whole lives are destroyed. Their families' lives are destroyed. Okay, people's lives are absolutely obliterated for this. I think that's horrendous. And people, and a lot of people in this country don't think about that. They don't think about the effect of our punishments. And I was speaking to somebody who was in prison, solitary confinement for some 46 months. Wasn't even convicted. He was just in solitary during the trial, from the time he was arrested. He was not even convicted. And at one point he had 1 hour of time a day to go outside at night into the courtyard, which was not even a courtyard, it was covered. But the person who shared the time when he was in the courtyard was actually the founder of the Crips, the gang. And he talked to him and he asked him, if you could have your hand cut off. And this guy's in prison for life, okay? The head founder of the Crips. If you could have your hand cut off or be in prison, which would you have? He said,